Welcome to the series of Lenten meditations or thoughts appropriate to the season of Lent. It is customary among Christians to focus during this period of time on the suffering of Jesus Christ. And within that, the focus is somewhat entirely on how Jesus suffered, the various details of his humiliation, physical torture, culminating on his death on the cross, where he was nailed with 3 nails on a wooden cross. So the obsession is only with how, the manner of his humiliation, torment, and death. I would like to argue through this video that this is not enough. In fact, this could be very counterproductive. Counterproductive in the sense that this promotes or serves to promote sentimentality about the suffering of Jesus Christ, and by doing so, to hinder or obstruct the encountering of the truth that Jesus was, and particularly the truth of the suffering of Jesus. Jesus introduced himself as the truth, which means every aspect of his life, including his final week upon this earth of humiliation and torment, has to be understood with relation to the truth. And that is possible only when we ask the question, why? Why did Jesus have to suffer? We remain obsessed with, fixated on how he suffered, we will never come to the point of asking ourselves the question, why did he have to suffer? So therefore, through this video, I propose to offer a corrective to the kind of sentimentality that seems to thrive among Christians during this part of the year. Now, in order to understand this, let me use a biblical illustration or biblical example. And this might seem a very out of the way or strange example, but as we proceed, I hope the logic of using this example would become more and more clear. Think of the message to the church at Laodicea as found in the 3rd chapter of the book of Revelation, verses 15 to 20. What was the condemnation that the church in Laodicea invited upon itself? It stated very clearly, you are neither hot nor cold, but you are lukewarm. Neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm, and therefore I will spew you out of my mouth. Spewing the church of Laodicea out of the mouth of God is the most emphatic metaphor of condemnation and rejection. Therefore, we must understand that being lukewarm is a completely unacceptable and utterly deplorable state from the perspective of what is required of us in the spiritual context. The one thing, the one luxury we cannot afford if we are spiritual is the luxury of being lukewarm. Unfortunately, that is a luxury that most people covet. They do not want to get into any trouble, do not want to attract any inconvenience, much less loss upon themselves. They want to have an easy passage through life, and therefore the option of being neither hot nor cold appeals to them a great deal. Not realizing that this is a one option that is utterly inadmissible to the sphere of spirituality. Why is it so? And that is something that is not often explained. And my purpose here is to make it as clear as I possibly can, which may not be clear enough, but could well point to the direction in which you may seek clarity regarding this most crucial spiritual insight. So, what is the problem with being lukewarm? To answer that question, the first thing we could perhaps remind ourselves of is the fact that Jesus was never lukewarm. Jesus was meek and humble, and in the words of John the Baptist, he was like the sacrificial lamb that takes upon itself the sins of the world. As Jesus was coming towards him, and as John the Baptist noticed him, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world." Yes, he was the meek and mild sacrificial lamb. He was the bread of life. He was the light of life. He was a friend to his disciples. He was kind and compassionate to anyone who approached him with any need whatsoever. He gathered unto himself the outcasts and the social refuse. He was tolerant towards the weak and the vulnerable, and he responded to the needs of everyone, irrespective of whatever labels or discriminations human beings create and slap on others. But while all this is true, the one thing that you cannot say about Jesus Christ is that he was lukewarm. The reason, of course, is very simple. If Jesus was lukewarm, two things certainly would not happen. One, Jesus would not respond so effectively, spontaneously, and remedially to every situation of human need and suffering, every situation of injustice and oppression. Secondly, Jesus would not have the kind of impact on the officialdom of the times, both the religious and the political. If Jesus were lukewarm, he would not have invited the wrathful attention of the custodians of religion, and to a lesser extent, the keepers of the political establishment. He would have lived up to the ripe old age, like in my case. Instead, his life was snuffed out at the prime. He was barely 32 and a half years old when he was killed via crucifixion on Calvary. Not only that, and this is most important for us to realize, Jesus struck everyone who came into contact with him, everyone who came within an earshot of his influence. Jesus struck everyone as someone quite out of the way, quite unusual, quite extraordinary. He carried with him the fragrance of freshness. The one thing you cannot say about Jesus is that he was stereotypical. In fact, Jesus always presented to everyone in every situation, in every interaction, an element of the unpredictable, the astonishing, the unprecedented, the surprising, and in many instances, the shocking. Now, this is most important for us to realize. Why? Because in the case of one who sets out to make the will of God prevail in this world, it becomes absolutely imperative. There is no choice about it. It becomes imperative to differ from the world. The paradox is you cannot help the world unless you differ from the ways of the world, the assumptions, customs, traditions, patterns of the world for the sake of the world. Suppose I am just like the world. I am just like a worldly person. How in the world am I going to be able to help him in his spiritual anguish? In order to help a person, he has to be very different from the person he has to help. For example, if someone comes to me as a pauper and says, "I've lost all my wealth, my family is suffering, there is no bread to eat." If I'm in the same predicament, how do I help him? I have to have some wealth to be able to relieve the financial and economic distress of that destitute. In the same manner, if one is to help the world at all to improve its ways, to be in a better state, one has to differ from the ways and the patterns of the world. It is for this reason that Paul writes so very clearly and beautifully in the letter to Romans chapter 12 verse 2, "Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but rather be transformed through the daily renewal of your mind in that excellent and indispensable will of God the Father for you. Why shouldn't we conform to the ways of the world? Not because the world is all perverse and wicked. The world is corrupt, no doubt about it. But the world is something that God created, and therefore the world is something that God still loves. That's what John tells us in his beautiful gospel. Chapter 3, verse 16. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. God loves this world. But, and that's a spiritual paradox, we have to differ from the ways of the world, the values, the goals, the priorities, and the strategies of the world in order to help the world. So, this element of difference is extremely crucial, and that is precisely what is at stake of being dissipated over a period of time when the individual believer or the churches concerned enter into a state of compromise with the ways of the world and therefore lose all the difference there is between the world and the church, or any worldly institution and the church. And none other than the great French philosopher Auguste Comte, Auguste, pronounced Auguste Comte, said that the Catholic Church should not be considered a church. In fact, though he was a Catholic himself, he always referred to the Catholic Church as the Catholic system, because it functioned like any other system. Even today, many Catholics take pride in saying that the Catholic Church is the most efficient business machine in the world, and quite rightly so. It is certainly a very competent, very efficient business organization. And it has become so in a state of compromise with the ways of the world. I don't want to go into details because it's not very edifying to mention these things. But what I want to really focus on, insist, and elaborate upon is the fact that unless we differ from the ways of the world, we cannot help the world, or we cannot help the world by becoming like the world. Now, for a moment, let us therefore concentrate on Jesus Christ and see how he was how he was not lukewarm, but was either cold or hot. For example, Jesus was very cold towards Satan. He refused to respond to, if you refuse to cooperate with the intentions and stratagems of the evil one. But he was not cold to the people who in need came to him for help. He responded readily, and his heart moved, his stomach churned at the sight of human deprivation. He was certainly not cold towards the manifestation of the corruption of the church, as in the Jerusalem temple where his blood boiled, at the sight of the perversions that were practiced in the sacred precincts. So he was hot, he was red hot. So he was either cold or hot. He was never lukewarm. You never find Jesus lukewarm. And the same thing you find about the apostles of Jesus Christ, the original apostles. That's why wherever they went, they had an impact. And people began to say, they're the people, that's referring to the apostles, the disciples of Jesus Christ, other than Judas Iscariot, who by then had ceased to exist, soon after betraying Jesus and soon after realizing the enormity of the offense he committed, he went and hanged himself. So we are referring to the rest. The people who turned the world upside down have come here also. So certainly their presence was not lukewarm. Absolutely not. So there is something to be said in favor of being either cold or hot, and certainly not being lukewarm. Now, this particular insight is absolutely essential to understand the passion with a capital P, or the suffering of Jesus Christ. And I'm surprised no end, that for centuries the suffering of Jesus Christ has been meditated upon. in many parts of the world, all over Christendom, without any reference whatsoever to this reality. Why did Jesus have to suffer? Jesus suffered because he was either cold or hot. That is precisely what the world does not want. The world will tolerate and, in fact, reward those who are lukewarm, because lukewarm people are very convenient. They do not cause any headaches or migraine to anybody. They are very convenient and comfortable to have around. They don't upset the apple cart. They don't question anything. They don't have the prophetic voice. They will never be the voice crying in the wilderness. John the Baptist was certainly not lukewarm, and he had to pay the price for it. And Jesus was not lukewarm, but not exactly in the mode of John the Baptist, but not far different from it, because we know that the conspiracy to get rid of Jesus Christ gathered momentum after he cleansed the temple of Jerusalem, thereby offering a frontal challenge to the economic interest and the covetousness of the priestly class. So, my submission is this: you cannot understand the logic of the suffering of Jesus Christ without realizing that he was paying the price for not being lukewarm. And from this, we have to come to the realization of the fact that it is this lukewarmness which is not acceptable to the spiritual discipline of life, which is required of every believer, every member of every church. If you want to be accepted as a regular and normal member of a church today, the one fundamental requirement is that you have to be lukewarm. Now, there's a requirement even more fundamental than that, and that is that you should be paying all the dues to the church. But other than that, the really decisive requirement, the eligibility requirement of a person to be a member of a church is that he should be lukewarm. And this in spite of the fact that in the Bible, that's the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, chapter 3, very emphatically states beyond any shadow of doubt that being lukewarm is the one condition that's completely repugnant in the sight of God. How has this monstrous contradiction come about? Now, please notice that Jesus is not lukewarm even through the process of his trial and condemnation, and also on the cross of Calvary. He is vital, is active, and he's so different from the ways of the world. Now, this idea of being hot or cold is fundamentally, as I said, the idea of being different to the ways and patterns of the world. There was always this surprise element, an astonishing element, an unpredictable element in the responses and reactions of Jesus Christ. And he recommends that to his followers. For example, when Jesus said, if someone slaps you on one cheek, you should show him the other also. What would be the effect of showing the other cheek if you are slapped on one cheek? You will certainly be astonishing the aggressor. And by doing so, you will be quickening in him something that has never woken up till that point in time. So, the fundamental duty of a follower of Jesus Christ, or a believer or a disciple, is to confront the world with this element of the unprecedented, the unpredictable, the new, and the stimulation to wake up. See, what happens is, due to our conditioning by virtue of growing up and being trained and formed within a context, a large part of our being, vital being, goes to sleep. And that's the idea of being habituated, being trained, being conditioned. Our consciousness begins to shrink more and more. And the spiritual strategy is to administer that jolt by which the sleeping dimension of our humanity is woken up. So, when somebody slaps you on one cheek and you show the other, suddenly that person begins to think afresh. If at all he has any capacity to think, and we should not become so cynical about fellow human beings as to conclude that they have no capacity to think. They are so hard-hearted that even the gesture of turning the other cheek will have no beneficial effect on him. If we are so cynical, then of course the spiritual option is not for us. Think of Jesus' reaction, response, and way of managing any given situation. Throughout the four Gospels, you will find that in every situation he responded in a manner that surprised everybody else. Take the instance of Jesus feeding a huge crowd of 5,000 men, not including the women and children. If they are also counted in property, the crowd was as large as 15,000 or 20,000. Think of Jesus feeding 5,000 men out of a boy's small food packet. Rather than plucking bread from the air, he shows the humility of accepting a small packet of food from a boy. Even that is very surprising, isn't it? Anyone else, going by the standards that is current in our midst of the Christian government, they would have shown off. They would have considered below their dignity to accept that small packet of food from an anonymous little boy. Think of the way Jesus reacted to the paralytic that was brought to him. Nobody else reacted to that man in that manner. Think of the way Jesus reacted to the man who had been waiting to be healed for 38 years beside the pool of Bethesda. Such a thought, such a question. Jesus asked him, "Do you want to be healed?" Imagine asking this question, "Do you want to be healed?" to a man who had been waiting at the pool of Bethesda for 38 long years. To all of us, such a question borders on insanity. A sane person will not ask such a question. The problem with us is that we are too sane to be relevant and effective. So there is always that ineradicable, inevitable element of freshness, newness, unpredictability about the response of Jesus Christ. That is the proof that he differs in a very meaningful, redemptive, and creative manner from the jaded, settled ways and stereotypes of the world. That's a creative freedom, that's a spiritual freedom that Jesus manifests. But though this is the hope of humanity, humanity can be helped only with this. Though this is the hope of humanity, is the one thing that the authorities of the world will never tolerate. This is the reason why original thinkers are disliked, feared, and persecuted. That's why Jesus laments as he sees the city of Jerusalem, the city of God, with these words, O Jerusalem, you who have the tradition of stoning to death the prophets that come to your midst." Why is it that a people, apparently a very religious people, apparently a people who presume themselves to be very close to God, why is it that they cannot tolerate the voice of the prophet? Because the voice of the prophet is unpredictable. Because the voice of the prophet is meant to jolt people into a new awareness, which nobody wants. And Jesus did that in a very, very creative and critical manner, the power of which could not be resisted by this religious establishment of the time. Therefore, they concluded that this man was insufferable, and therefore eliminating him was felt to be a fundamental need. This, my dear brothers and sisters, is a logic that led to the crucifixion of the Son of Man, in whom there was no guilt at all, on the cross of Calvary. Unless and until you understand this logic, you cannot understand the meaning, the scope, and the spiritual profundity of the suffering of Jesus Christ. So, the cross is the price that a believer has to pay for not being lukewarm. And that fundamental pattern has not changed. Therefore, if you and I do not suffer, and if you have an easy passage in any context, please remember, it's because we are lukewarm. And we are therefore nowhere near the spiritual calling, which really should constitute the bottom line identification mark for each one of us. So, the cross of Jesus Christ is the insignia that we are staying true and faithful to our calling to be different from the world for the sake of the world. And it's this that animates through the words of Jesus Christ as found towards the culminating section of the Beatitudes. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil falsely against you for my sake. Blessed are you, in other words, when you are either hot or cold, but never lukewarm, for my sake, for great is your reward in heaven. So if we are not suffering at all today, if we are popular everywhere, if we are the darlings and minions of the religious establishment, its keepers and henchmen, there is good enough ground to worry. It means that we have renounced our vocation, or we are at a safe distance from what it means to be a true spiritual presence. And again, Jesus buttresses this idea or strengthens this idea by saying, you are the salt of the earth. Now, a salt is not indifferent to the context in which it is placed. You put some salt into the dish that you cook. The salt doesn't go and stand in one corner without lending its flavor to the rest of the dish. Jesus says, you are the light of the world. The light is never lukewarm. It makes an impact. And when light comes, there is a complete transformation of the context. Therefore, again and again and again, I say, the one thing that a follower of Jesus Christ cannot afford to, the one luxury that is completely disallowed to us, is a luxury of being lukewarm. But unfortunately, that's the one eligibility requirement within the systems and structures that have been created in the name of Jesus, who himself said that he is the light of the world. And the model that is given us is one of passionate response whenever and wherever the will of God is compromised, or is even in a remote or even at a remote danger of being compromised. As in the second chapter of John's Gospel, in the context of the wedding of Cana, where his own mother comes to him and tells him they have no wine. Look at the way Jesus reacts. Very hot. Woman, what is there between you and me? Am I not here to do my Father's will? That's the heat. That's the heat. And from a worldly point of view, you would think that Jesus is being impolite and discourteous towards his mother. It is not that he was inconsiderate or disrespectful towards his mother. It is that he cannot be indifferent in matters spiritual where fundamental principles are at risk of being compromised. And therefore, he responds. As William Blake, the English poet, says, like the tiger, 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 burning bright in the forest of the night. That is the person of Jesus Christ. And are you surprised that his contemporaries, especially the keepers and custodians of religion, found him too much of a handful to tolerate him and let him survive? They had to get rid of him. They had to get rid of him. So they did. And that's the event that we are required by the calendar of the various churches to meditate upon, to understand. And how in the world can we understand the logic and the meaning of this suffering if you do not understand this fundamental principle and apply it to the sum total of the suffering and the death of atonement of Jesus Christ? So I submit these thoughts in humility and happiness to all of you, with the further request that you take it up for continued meditation. And I can assure you that if you do so, it will lead you to very significant and self-invigorating spiritual insights, which I hope very sincerely proves to be the case with each one of you. May God bless you.